They turned me away long before they ever knew my name. And maybe that's where this story really begins, not at the ranch, not with the baby, but with the sound of a door closing softly enough that it pretended to be polite. You know that sound, not a slam, a careful click, the kind that says, "We're decent people, just not decent enough to keep you." I learned early that rejection doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it smiles while it does the damage. Town after town had the same look about it, the same slow lift of the eyes, the same pause once they took me in, clothes worn thin at the elbows, boots repaired more times than replaced. A way of standing that comes from learning not to take up too much space. People say they don't judge, but bodies tell the truth faster than mouths ever could. Shoulders stiffen, hands stop what they're doing, conversations find a reason to end. I wasn't chased out. I was uninvited to stay. Work was always just filled. Rooms were already promised. Kitchens suddenly ran out of space. And when I did get the courage to ask, because asking takes courage when you've been told no enough times, I learned to phrase it carefully. Never "do you need me?" Always "is there anything I can help with?" Because need makes people nervous. Help feels safer. Still, the answer came back the same. And here's the thing I want you to hear. I didn't blame them. That's the part that hurts the most. I understood. I looked like trouble, like someone who might linger, like someone whose hunger wasn't just for food, but for something harder. To give back once offered. Belonging costs. And people protect their peace the way ranchers protect land, by fencing it off and hoping what's outside figures out how to survive on its own. I learned to keep moving. The road teaches you things. It teaches you how to read the sky like a letter written just for you. How to listen to your own footsteps so you don't feel so alone. It teaches you how much a person can carry when they don't have the option to put anything down. A small bag, a blanket, a tin cup, and something else I never talked about. Something I didn't know how to explain without sounding strange. Children, or maybe not children themselves, but the quiet language they speak before they ever learn words. The way a breath catches before a cry. The difference between hunger and fear. The way a tiny body settles when it recognizes safety even if it doesn't know why. It wasn't something I studied. It was something that happened to me. Back when I still believed in staying. Back when there had been a house and voices, and then one day only echoes. I won't linger there. Some losses don't need details. They need respect. But whatever broke me open back then left this behind. An instinct, a knowing, a steadiness that showed up whenever a child was afraid. I didn't think it was special. I thought it was just what you do. Until I realized not everyone could do it. Not everyone could sit through hours of crying without flinching. Not everyone could hold something fragile without trying to control it. Still, that skill didn't buy me a place in the world. You can't eat instinct. You can't trade gentleness for a roof. And so the road kept unspooling in front of me, one dusty mile after another, until my boots carried me to the edge of that ranch. I didn't know it was the place. You never do. It just looked like another stretch of land guarded by another man who'd learned to trust fences more than people. The sun was dropping low, that gold kind of light that makes even hard things look merciful for a moment. I remember thinking I'd walk past. I remember telling myself not to hope. Hope has a way of making rejection echo louder. But then I heard the baby. Not a cry at first. A sound smaller than that. Tight. Wound up. The kind of sound that says someone has been crying so long they're running out of air to keep doing it. It stopped me where I stood. Didn't matter how tired I was. Didn't matter how many times I'd sworn I wouldn't ask again. I waited. That's important. I didn't rush in. You learn, when you're unwanted, not to assume your presence will be welcomed even in emergencies. The sound came again, sharper this time, and underneath it I heard voices. Frustrated, tired, people who had already tried everything they knew. I stepped forward then, slow, hands visible, like you do when you don't want to be mistaken for a threat. The rancher looked at me the way everyone else had. Up and down. Quick inventory. Decision forming before a word was spoken. I could feel it. That familiar closing. And so I spoke fast, not to interrupt, but because timing matters. When you're about to be dismissed. I'm not asking to stay, I said. That part came out first. Honest. Necessary. I can leave right after. He didn't answer. The baby cried harder, as if offended by the pause. I just thought, I continued, softer now. I could hold the child, just for a bit. There it was, the line I'd never used before. The truth I usually kept folded up inside because it sounded like a plea even when it wasn't meant to be one. They turned me away before the sentence finished forming on my tongue. I saw it in his eyes, the reflex, and I don't blame him for that either. People show up with promises all the time. Promises are easy. What's rare is someone asking only for the weight of responsibility, even temporarily. I didn't move closer. I didn't insist. I waited again, because children, like doors, don't respond well to force. The baby's cry broke into sobs, deep and shuddering now, the kind that rattles a grown person's bones if they let it. And something shifted then. Not in me, in him. The rancher's jaw tightened. His shoulders sagged just a fraction, like a man who'd been holding something up too long without realizing how heavy it had become. "You got experience?" he asked. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because there are questions that miss the point entirely, and still somehow manage to be the only ones people know how to ask. "Yes," I said, and no word had ever carried more of my life in it. He nodded once, sharp, like he'd already decided this wasn't going to work but didn't see another option in front of him. He stepped aside. That first step onto the porch felt like crossing into another world. Same sky, same dirt, but suddenly I was inside the circle of what mattered to someone else. I remember the smell: milk, dust, wood, and something faintly sweet. I remember the baby's face, red and furious and exhausted from the effort of existing. I didn't speak. I didn't smile. I didn't perform. I simply held up my arms. The moment the child was placed against me, everything slowed. Breathing first, mine and theirs. Then the small, trembling fists loosened. The crying didn't stop all at once. It unwound, like a knot finally remembering how it had been tied. A shudder, a sigh, a long, quiet stretch of silence that felt holy in a way churches sometimes forget how to be. No one said anything. You don't talk over a miracle when it's still deciding whether to stay. I rocked slightly, not because I'd planned to, because my body remembered what to do. The baby's head fit perfectly under my chin, like it had been waiting for that exact space. And I knew with the kind of certainty that doesn't need proof that this was the only reason I'd been allowed to walk this far. I was still unwanted, still poor, still carrying everything I owned on my back. But for that moment, none of it mattered, because someone needed me in a way that didn't require explanation. And sometimes that's enough to keep a person standing. I didn't look at the rancher. I didn't need to. I could feel his attention like heat, watching, measuring, trying to understand how something so simple could work when nothing else had. The baby slept, and in that quiet, before anyone spoke again, before decisions were made or promises imagined, there was this fragile breathing pause. The kind that comes right before a life turns without announcing it's about to. I hadn't asked for a home. I hadn't asked to belong. I had only asked to hold the child. And sometimes this is the part I want you to carry with you. Sometimes the smallest request is the truest one we make, because it reveals who we are without asking anyone to save us. The doors had closed behind me everywhere else. But in that moment, standing on that porch with a sleeping baby in my arms, I didn't feel shut out anymore. I felt invited to exist. He didn't say thank you. Not then. Not the way people expect gratitude to show up. He just stood there, watching the child sleep like the world hadn't almost come apart a few minutes earlier. And I understood that too. Some men don't thank the rain for falling. They just note that the ground is softer in the morning. The baby slept on, heavy and trusting, and I stayed still because stillness is a kind of promise. You don't shift when something fragile has finally decided it's safe. You let your arms ache. You let time stretch. You let the moment teach you how rare it is. The rancher cleared his throat once, like he was testing whether his voice still belonged to him. "You can sit," he said, nodding toward a chair that had seen better days. It wasn't an invitation. It was an allowance, and I took it with the respect it deserved. Night settled the way it does out there, wide and unhurried. The kind of dark that doesn't press in, just waits. Lamps were lit. Someone whispered something about supper. I didn't catch the words, and it didn't matter. My world had narrowed to the steady rise and fall beneath my chin. Eventually, he spoke again. "You can stay the night, Just that. No explanation. No conditions spoken aloud. But there were conditions, of course. There always are. They hung in the air between us like fence wire, visible if you knew where to look, sharp if you leaned too hard. I nodded. I didn't smile. Smiles can feel like bargaining chips, and I wasn't bargaining. I was accepting what was offered without pretending it was more than it was. The baby woke later, as babies do, with no regard for plans or mercy. The cries started small and then rose, urgent and offended by the betrayal of hunger. I stood before anyone asked. Muscle memory again. The rancher paused, watching me make the bottle, measuring every movement. Not suspicious exactly. Curious. Like someone watching a language he doesn't speak but somehow understands. Midnight has a sound on a ranch. It's quieter than silence. Boards settling. A far-off animal shifting weight. The breath of the land itself. I hummed then. Not a song anyone would recognize. Just a thread of sound steady enough to hold on to. The baby quieted, eyes fluttering, trusting that whatever held them knew what it was doing. That's when I felt it, the weight of being observed. He stood in the doorway, the rancher, arms crossed, not hiding the fact that he was watching. Men like him don't pretend not to notice. They just don't comment until they've decided what something means. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer advice. He didn't take the child from me the moment the crying stopped. He let the moment finish itself. And that told me more about him than any kindness would have. Loss leaves a mark. Responsibility carves it deeper. You could see it in his face, in the way rest never quite reached his eyes, in the posture of someone who sleeps lightly even when exhaustion begs otherwise. This was a man who had learned that if things were going to fall apart, they would do it on his watch. And he had decided long ago that watching was better than being surprised. The night went on like that. Feedings, rocking, silence. At some point, the baby slept again. Deeper this time. The kind of sleep that makes you breathe easier just by witnessing it. I eased into the chair, careful not to wake them. You've done this before, he said, not a question. Yes, I replied again. Same word, different weight. He nodded once. Then he surprised me. Get some rest. I'll take the next one. I should tell you I almost refused. Not because I didn't trust him, but because when you've been useful for so long, rest feels like a risk. Rest feels like you might wake up and find out you're no longer needed. But I handed the child over, slowly, carefully, and he held them like a man relearning how to hold something precious without breaking it. Awkward at first, then steadier, like riding a horse that finally decides not to bolt. I slept on a narrow cot with a blanket that smelled like sun and dust. It wasn't comfort that put me to sleep. It was relief, the kind that seeps in when you're no longer bracing for the next snow. Morning came soft, pale light through the window. The baby fussed, not cried. Fussed. Progress. I was up before anyone called my name, if anyone even knew it yet. The day unfolded in small permissions. Coffee poured without asking. A plate slid across the table. Not generosity, normalcy. And that can feel even bigger when you haven't had it in a while. The rancher watched all of it. How I moved. How I didn't linger where I wasn't needed. How I didn't disappear either. He noticed. The way the baby settled faster with me. The way my presence smoothed the sharp edges of the day without demanding attention for it. He didn't comment. He waited. That's what wary people do. They wait for the trick, the reveal, the moment when kindness turns out to be leverage. But there was no trick. Just repetition. Feed. Hold. Settle. Again and again. Until it wasn't impressive anymore, just true. That second night, the baby wouldn't sleep unless I stayed nearby. Not held. Just there. A quiet gravity. I sat on the floor, back against the wall, listening to the rhythm of the house finding its way around an extra heartbeat. The rancher passed by once. Stopped. Looked down at me sitting there, half asleep, entirely present. He opened his mouth, like he might say something, then closed it. Some realizations need time to land without being named. You see, homes remember things. They remember laughter and shouting and grief and absence. And sometimes, without meaning to, they remember silence too well. That ranch had known a kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful. The kind that echoes. The kind that reminds you who isn't coming back. Something gentle had returned to it, not loud, not dramatic. Just a softness where everything had been sharp. for too long. The third night, he spoke differently. Not about staying, not about leaving, about the weather, about a fence that needed mending, about ordinary things that only get mentioned when someone assumes you'll be there to hear them. That's how belonging starts. Not with declarations, with continuity. I still didn't unpack my bag. I still didn't ask questions about tomorrow. Because when you've been turned away enough, you learn to live inside today. Today has hands and breath and needs you can meet. Tomorrow is a rumor, but I felt it. In the way the baby reached for me without searching. In the way the rancher no longer hovered, but trusted. In the way the house breathed easier at night. He stood in the doorway again, one evening, watching the baby sleep against my shoulder. The same doorway, a different man. You don't ask for much, he said. I smiled then, just a little. I ask for what I can carry. He nodded slowly, and in that nod was something like understanding, maybe even respect. He didn't say you can stay, not yet, but he didn't say you have to go either. And for someone like me, someone who had learned to measure life in departures, that pause was everything. And just when you start to believe that quiet means safe, the world clears its throat. It never arrives all at once. Trouble rarely does. It seeps in through side doors and half-heard conversations. A pause that lingers too long. A look that doesn't warm the way it used to. I felt it before I understood it. The way you feel weather changing in a bone that once broke and never quite forgot. It began with voices lowering when I entered a room. Not stopping, no, that would have been honest, but softening, as if volume itself might betray intent. Ranch hands who had nodded now hesitated. Eyes that once passed over me without thought now lingered, measuring. Not cruel, curious. And curiosity, when left unattended, has a way of turning sharp. People notice things. They always do. They noticed I wasn't kin. They noticed I didn't have a story I told easily. They noticed the baby slept better with me. And that kind of thing unsettles folks more than crying ever could. Because it raises questions no one wants to ask out loud. Why you? What does that mean about us? Someone said it first as a joke. Those are the safest knives. Funny how that kid won't settle unless they're around. They laughed, not looking at me. Laughter followed. Thin, nervous, and something in the air shifted, like a chair. Legs scraping back just enough to make sound. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I kept doing the work in front of me, because when you've been unwanted before, you learn that explanations don't save you. They just give people more material to misunderstand. The rancher noticed. Of course he did. He noticed everything. But he said nothing. And silence, when it comes from someone in power, can feel like shelter or like distance. I didn't know which this was yet. The town got wind of me next. Towns always do. News travels faster than truth when there's nothing better to do with it. Someone asked him at the feed store who I was. Someone else asked how long I was staying. Someone else asked, careful as a surgeon, whether it was wise to have a stranger around a child. That one landed. I wasn't there, but I felt it anyway. The question carried itself back to the ranch like dust on a boot heel. And once something like that is spoken, it doesn't matter how gently it was phrased. It leaves a mark. The rancher came home quieter that night. Not angry, guarded. I could feel him thinking from across the room, the way his presence grew heavier without moving. He watched me with the baby, not like before, not with curiosity or reluctant respect, but with something tighter underneath. Fear, not of me, of what he might lose. Attachment is a risk some people can't afford twice. I understood that. I'd lived that truth in my own body. Loving something makes you visible to pain. And for people who have survived by becoming small, invisibility feels like safety. Still, I felt the ground shifting. It came to a head over something so small it almost feels embarrassing to name it. A bruise, purple blue, blooming soft on the baby's arm. Not fresh, not severe. The kind that happens when learning to move in a body that hasn't figured itself out yet. But bruises don't explain themselves. Someone saw it. Someone who was already looking. Someone who wanted to be right about the unease they'd been carrying. And suddenly the air was full of meaning that didn't belong to me. I noticed the rancher staring at the bruise longer than necessary. Not accusing, not yet, but counting, adding, revisiting every moment he hadn't been present. Every time he'd trusted the quiet. I don't know how that happened, I said. Because honesty is reflexive when you have nothing to hide. He nodded. Once. Too quickly. That night, the baby cried longer than usual. I held them through it. Heart thudding. Not because of the sound, but because I could feel eyes on me again. Not from the doorway this time. From memory. From fear. I slept lightly. Dreams crowded with doors. The next day, he didn't ask me to help. Not directly. He did it himself. Awkwardly. Determined. Proving something to himself more than to anyone else. I stayed out of the way, because that's another thing the unwanted learn. Don't compete for space. Let people choose you. Freely or not at all. But the baby cried. Not in pain. In confusion. That particular cry that asks a question rather than making a demand. And the sound worked its way under the skin of the house, raising every old ache with it. He handed the child back to me without meeting my eyes. Relief washed through him too quickly. And that scared him. You could see it. How much he needed this to work and how dangerous that need felt. By evening, he finally spoke. Not gently. Not harshly. Carefully. Like a man stepping across ice he doesn't trust. People are talking, he said. I nodded. I didn't ask who. It didn't matter. They're asking questions. I nodded again. Still no defense rising in me. Just a tired acceptance. Because I knew this part of the story already. I'd lived it in different towns, different faces, same ending. I can leave, I said. Not dramatically. Not as a test. Just as a fact. The way you say the sun will set. And that's when something broke open between us. He turned on me then. Not with anger. With pain. That's what you think this is about? He asked. You think I just send people off when things get difficult? I met his eyes. Really met them. No, I said softly. I think you're afraid of what happens if you don't. Silence. Slammed down harder than any shout. Because fear recognized itself. He paced, hands raking through his hair. A man wrestling something he couldn't rope. I lost. He stopped. Swallowed. Started again. I can't. Another stop. Another breath. Some sentences are graves. You don't finish them. I understand, I said. And I meant it. Understanding doesn't erase hurt, but it keeps it from turning cruel. He looked at me then like he was seeing me for the first time. Not as a solution. Not as a problem. As a person standing in the path of his worst memory. The accusation came. Anyway. From town. Formal this time. A visit. Polite. Concerned. Questions wrapped in civility. They didn't look at me when they asked them. They looked at him. As if my fate was already decided, and he was the only variable left. I stood there and listened to my life being discussed like weather. Like risk. Like something to manage. No one asked me anything. The baby slept through it all. That felt important. After they left, the house was unbearably quiet. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that presses on your ears until you feel you might scream just to prove you still exist. He stood by the window for a long time, watching dust settle, watching the road they'd taken disappear back into nothing. You know they won't stop, he said finally. I nodded. They never do. You could go, he said. Before this gets worse. There it was. The offer dressed up as mercy. I picked up my bag that night. Not because he told me to. Because I knew how this story usually ends. And I didn't want the child to be awake when it happened. I didn't want crying mixed with leaving. I didn't want my last gift to this place to be disruption. I folded the blanket carefully. Habit. Respect. I stood by the door longer than necessary, letting myself feel the weight of what I was giving up without pretending I hadn't known it might come to this. He found me there. You don't have to, he said. His voice wasn't steady. I looked at him. At the man who had almost let fear decide for him. At the man still standing in the space between who he'd been and who he might become. I know, I said. But sometimes leaving is the only way people realize what they're about to lose. He didn't answer. He just stood there torn. Clean down the middle, and in that moment, standing on the edge of being discarded once more, I felt the old wound open. The one that says this is all you're ever worth. The one that whispers don't be surprised. The one that tells you to expect abandonment so it hurts less when it arrives. But something else was there too, awaiting. Not mine. His. And, for the first time in a long time, my fate wasn't sealed by the assumptions of others. It rested in the hands of someone who had to choose whether fear or love would get the final word. I set my bag down and waited. I waited the way you wait when you've already lived the ending once and you don't trust yourself to hope for a different one. Still, quiet, not bargaining with the air, just breathing through the old ache and letting it remind me that I'd survived before. The house felt smaller then, not because anything had changed, but because the space between us had grown heavy with choice. He stood near the doorway, one hand braced against the frame like the building itself might drift if he let go. I stood with my bag at my feet, the baby asleep in the next room, unaware of how close their world had come to breaking again. That's the cruel thing about moments like these. The ones who need the most protection are often the only ones at peace. The sound came first, not crying. A sharp intake of breath, that hitch that comes before panic, before the body decides whether it's safe enough to fall apart. I turned before I thought. Instinct doesn't ask permission. The baby was awake, eyes wide, too wide, small hands trembling, searching for something familiar and not finding it fast enough. Fear had arrived ahead of sound, and that's always the dangerous part. I crossed the room into steps and gathered them up, heart hammering, murmuring. Nonsense words that weren't nonsense at all. Just reassurance dressed up as sound. The body remembers before the mind catches up. The baby pressed into me like gravity had suddenly increased, breath stuttering until it finally found rhythm. Again. But the rancher saw it. Saw the way panic had overtaken calm in seconds. Saw the way my arms steadied without urgency, without force. Saw something he hadn't allowed himself to see yet, not because it wasn't there, but because admitting it would demand something from him. Footsteps sounded on the porch then. Not one set. More. Voices. The town, arriving in flesh and bone, carrying concern like a badge and judgment like a tool. Someone knocked. Polite. Firm. The kind of knock that assumes it will be answered. The baby whimpered again at the sound, and I felt it then, the edge. The moment where fear could tip into something lasting if handled wrong. Children don't remember facts at that age. They remember feelings. They remember whether the world came apart when they were scared. The rancher looked from the door to us, back again, and something in his face shifted, not slowly this time. Suddenly, like a decision finally outrunning doubt. He opened the door. They didn't waste time. Neither did he. Questions came fast. Concern sharpened into accusation the longer it went unanswered. I stayed where I was, rocking gently, every muscle tuned to the small body in my arms. The baby's breathing evened, then faltered again as voices rose. "Lower your voices," he said. That stopped them. Not because they were respectful, because he'd never spoken that way before. "This child's already frightened." Someone gestured. "Toward me." "That's exactly no." He cut in, flat, final. "That's not it." Silence fell like a held breath. He stepped forward, placing himself between them and us without thinking about it first. And that more than anything told me the choice had already been made. "I've watched this person," he said, not explaining, testifying, night after night, day after day. "I've watched my child sleep because of them. I've watched calm return to this house because of them." Someone tried to interrupt. He didn't let them. "You want to talk about danger?" he went on, voice steady. Now, grounded in something deeper than fear. The danger was before they arrived. The danger was a house full of grief and a man too tired to admit he needed help. That landed. He turned then, looked at me, really looked. Not as a risk, not as a convenience, as someone whose presence had changed the shape of his life. "This isn't an employee," he said, and the word fell away like something outdated. "This is family." I felt it in my chest before I understood it with my mind. That tightening, that ache that comes when something you never thought you'd hear suddenly exists in the world. "They belong here," he said, louder now, clear enough that it carried beyond the doorway, clear enough that it couldn't be taken back. And anyone who can't accept that doesn't need to come back. No one argued. Not because they agreed, because certainty has a way of ending conversations. When they left, it wasn't triumphant. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that follows truth spoken out loud for the first time. The baby slept through it all. I stood there afterward, still holding them, afraid to move as if motion might undo what had just happened. The rancher closed the door and leaned against it, eyes closed, chest rising and falling like he'd run a long distance without realizing it. "You didn't have to do that," I said finally. Old habits don't vanish overnight. Yes, he said, opening his eyes. I did. He crossed the room then, slower than usual, like he didn't want to startle something new and fragile into disappearing. He reached out not for the baby but for my shoulder, rested his hand there, solid, present. I almost let them scare me, he said. I almost let them take something from me that I didn't know I could survive losing. I swallowed. Words crowded my throat and found no place to land. I've lost enough, he continued. I won't lose this too. We stood there like that for a long moment. The baby stirred, sighed, settled again. Life, insisting on continuity. He cleared his throat. You can put your bag away, he said. Not tentative, not conditional. You're not leaving. Something broke then. Quietly, cleanly. The old wound finally understanding it didn't have to keep reopening to prove it was real. I nodded. That was all I trusted myself to do. Days passed. Then weeks. The town adjusted, the way towns always do when certainty replaces rumor. The ranch breathed easier. Laughter returned in small, almost apologetic bursts, like it wasn't sure it was allowed back yet. The baby grew, stronger, louder, more opinionated about the world they were discovering. They reached for both of us now without hesitation, as if some part of them had always known there would be more than one set of arms to catch them. One evening, as the sun sank low and the land turned gold again, the rancher stood beside me on the porch. No words needed, just presence. You know, he said eventually, people think belonging is something you earn. I nodded. I'd thought that once too. But it's not, he continued. It's something you choose, over and over, even when it scares you. He looked at me then. Especially when it scares you. I watched the horizon, the way the light softened, everything it touched. I didn't come here looking for this, I said. I know, he replied. That's why it's real. The baby laughed from inside the house, a sound so pure it startled us both. We turned toward it at the same time, moving without thinking, because that's what family does. They respond, together, and standing there, with dust on my boots and a home behind me that knew my name, I understood something I'd spent years getting wrong. Belonging isn't granted by blood or permission or history. It's built in moments of choosing to stay when leaving would be easier, in speaking up when silence would protect you, in holding someone else's fear steady until they learn how to breathe again. They turned me away once, but someone finally said, without hesitation, without condition, you belong with us. And this time, the door didn't close.